Helldivers 2 has lost 80% of its player base. This has become kind of a trend, right? Where a game comes out, people cry about, like, oh man, this is the most popular game on Steam ever. Look at those player counts. Oh man, everyone should play this game. This proceeds for like a couple of weeks, and then there's like just this very sharp drop off, and there's no real recovery, right? It happened with Power World, and it happened again with Helldivers 2. And I do think this is a very strong indication of just how weak the big meme games are from PlayStation and Xbox right now. Because we saw like similar patterns last year with the really heavily shield titles, um, Hi-Fi Rush, Street Fighter 6, Diablo 4, Baldur's Gate 3. Like I remember like you couldn't go anywhere without people screaming at you about like, oh, Baldur's Gate 3 is the greatest bear hugging simulator ever. Ooh, like it's like people were trying to like say Baldur's Gate 3 was like the game of the year contender. Spider-Man 2 was shilled for a while there. Alan Wake 2 was shilled, but the reality is the really popular games that year, Zelda and Mario, have retained their relevancy well into the 2024, right? It's kind of impressive actually seeing people like continue talking about all the things you can do in Tears of the Kingdom, right? Like now, it feels like now that initial wave of like anti-Nintendo propaganda has like been forced to move on to the next big thing. Like now that Nintendo fans are allowed to just sit and play their games, it couldn't be more clear that Tears of the Kingdom and Super Mario Bros. Wonder are fantastic. Even if the industry is trying everything they can to downplay those games, right? But again, like that creates other problems, right? If you try and tell people that like, oh, Mario Wonder, it's not as good as New Super Mario Bros. Like you're destroying the entire narrative of your predecessors, who spent their entire lives trying to downplay those games and disrespect them and try to convince people that like Nintendo had completely lost their touch with the new Super Mario Bros. Series, right? Like that narrative cannot coexist with the idea that like Mario Wonder is bad. Like either Mario Wonder is better than new Super Mario Bros. Or it's not, right? And and again, we're having this weird conflict where people cannot decide on what they should be supporting because they can't downplay them both is the issue. And like we're seeing a similar thing with Tears of the Kingdom versus Breath of the Wild, right? You can't downplay them both. Either you say Tears of the Kingdom was worse, or it's a disappointment from like the all-time great Breath of the Wild, or you say it's a major improvement over Breath of the Wild. And again, the narrative that the game isn't competitive or isn't good, it just collapses. Just absolutely, right? Like the reality is, with the way things are now, gamers cannot write off Nintendo games the way they used to. It's becoming more and more obvious. It's becoming more and more apparent. They cannot keep doing this. And I think like the big indicator of this is just how like random Nintendo releases just remain so much more relevant than like the big high profile like high selling highly reviewed games, right? On paper Baldur's Gate 3 is almost as good as Tears of the Kingdom, right? Like just look at those Metacritic scores, look at those that critic coverage, look at that like that bear just grimacing at you. But in reality, the game doesn't live up to the hype, right? Like if you're like me and you're just like, oh, I want to play as a vampire. Oops, can't do it. Why? I thought this game was about doing whatever you want and being who you wanted to be. I thought this game was like a real RPG. Nope, you can't be a vampire. Okay, well, any interest I had in the game is gone, right? The game doesn't like allow you the flexibility to like do whatever you want, right? Like in spite of all the shilling, all the promotion, like Baldur's Gate 3 just does not live up to the hype. It does not live up to the expectations. Meanwhile, Zelda exceeds those expectations. And because it's so good, people will come back for hundreds, thousands of hours, just exploring every nook and cranny of that world, discovering every armor set, discovering every shrine, like discovering new quests, going on these crazy adventures across like the landscape of Hyrule, like fighting new bosses they've never seen before, right? Like making new discoveries, piecing together like the lore of the world and like just having a truly epic adventure. Like with Baldur's Gate 3, most people don't get past Act 1, right? Like this isn't me like exaggerating or making it up. Like that is like a proven phenomenon that Larian games are entirely front loaded, right? It has the illusion of choice, the illusion of freedom, the illusion to do whatever you want, as opposed to like Tears of the Kingdom, which actually delivers on its promises. And if anything kind of exceeds them, it's embarrassing that Baldur's Gate 3 was ever put up with The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. And now in 2024, it couldn't be more apparent that Baldur's Gate 3 is going to be forgotten. Alongside Forspoken, alongside Final Fantasy 16, Street Fighter 6, Tekken 8, and Helldivers 2 and Power World. They're all the same. The reality is we are living in a gaming industry where the high profile AAA releases by no name developers are not capable of competing with the Nintendo products in any way, shape, or form. Like those companies are entirely reliant on brand recognition and the idea that they are more adult and mature than Nintendo games in order to stay relevant. Like take that away from them and they have absolutely nothing. You know, like take away the illusion that these games are hardcore games for hardcore gamers, the mature games for mature gamers. Like take away that like the illusion of that. And like you're left with just like these empty skeletal husks of video games, right? Like with Helldivers 2, like what exactly made the game so special? Oh, it's like Starship Troopers. No, it's not. Like no, it's just like the movie. No, the movie was nothing like the book. You know, like the entire discourse was flawed from the start. Like you can try and like cope about how like oh Helldivers 2 was it's one of the most innovative shooting games in years. Like meanwhile Splatoon 3 has absolutely retained its player base more than Helldivers 2 has. It sold more to begin with and it has more players now. Helldivers 2 could never compete with that. But are you ever going to see people acknowledge that? No. Just like you're never going to see people acknowledge the fact that like Power World is a plagiarized knockoff of Pokemon that will never ever compete with what Nintendo puts out. Same with Baldur's Gate 3, same with Spider-Man 2. We are going to continue this facade that these games are competitive until the day and long after they all go out of business.